Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. I am in Manningtree in Essex, the smallest town in England, but it's also got another darker claim to fame. This was the location of a very famous witch hunt. In the 1640s, mass hysteria took over this town and several women were hunted down, tortured, and ultimately found guilty of being witches. So join me today as I go around, have a look what happened to all of this, what were some of the causes of all this, and crucially, who was the Witchfinder General? Now Manningtree is a rather beautiful place in this sort of calm inlet in the Essex coastline, and in 1645 it had been really quiet, very, very far away from anything. And this is a good place to talk about the causes of this witch hunt. Why did it take place? Well, there's several reasons really. One of the main reasons is this is 1645 at the height of the English Civil War. Britain is in chaos. Families are torn apart. Law and order is falling down. It's very hard to govern anybody. This sense of chaos is around everywhere. That also brings in things like disease and shipwrecks and general chaos. And in the situations like that, what people like to do is they like to blame somebody. And what's easier to blame than a vulnerable old woman? Additional to all of this, Britain is in a puritanical age, an age of Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans during the Civil War, bringing through that religious zeal that is rushing through the country. And part of that is this belief that in situations where there are shipwrecks, where there's disease, this is the work of the devil, and the devil takes its form, and it's meant to enter people, often women, vulnerable women. The devil comes into them and causes all of these terrible events. Fantastical stuff, but people really did genuinely believe this. And so a general state of chaos meets religious fervour, something's gonna blow up. This is the Red Lion at Manningtree, and it didn't quite look like this, but there was a Red Lion pub at the time in 1645, and it was here. And this obviously was the hub of activity in the village. And apparently just next door to the Red Lion lived a woman called Elizabeth Clark. Now she was about 80 years old, she was a widow, she was quite weak and feeble and vulnerable. Also potentially, not quite all her faculties with her or anything like that. And a man who also lived in a village by the name of John Rivet, his wife had become very ill, and for some reason, maybe he's sort of convinced about it, or maybe he's had some conversation in the pub about it. He is convinced that Elizabeth Clark is a witch, and she has bewitched his wife and made her ill. No evidence for this, of course, but as you can imagine, things get going. So what the villagers do, they decide they need to hire somebody to deal with the witches. Enter the Witchfinder General. This is the village of Missley, just over a little way from Manningtree. And in 1645, the pub behind me, the Thorn Inn, was bought by a young man called Matthew Hopkins. He was the son of a Puritan minister. I say young man, he'd made a bit of money as a lawyer and decided to buy a pub. Now he was full of religious zeal, this puritanical fervour, as it were, and he said one of his aims was to cleanse society of the devil. And in one form, of course, the devil appeared was through witches. So when the Manningtree authorities said they had this problem to do with witches, they didn't quite know what to do. It's quite expensive for these authorities to put this woman on trial. So Matthew Hopkins said, oh, don't worry, I'll do it for you. I will go and question her, and I'll go and find out the route to all these witches. The thing is, he's not just motivated by religious zeal, though. For if he gets a successful prosecution, the authorities would pay him the equivalent of what is now £1,000. So there's definitely a bit of monetary involvement here. Matthew Hopkins is going to cleanse society of the devil, yes, but he's also going to make a nice earner from it. The other thing to say about Matthew Hopkins is he was very theatrical in his style, and he knew that this was a game, to be played, and he knew he needed to sort of control the crowd, as it were, or entertain the crowd. So he called himself the Witchfinder General. It was him who made up that term, Witchfinder General. He dressed all in black and actually had a bit of a billowing cloak and this large hat, and would go around on horseback, looking very foreboding, almost sort of militaristic. I mean, he's just done it, he's self-appointed all of this. And he also wrote pamphlets, newsletters, spreading the sort of media, spreading a lot of this fake news around. And he came up with extraordinary terms for some of these witches, especially the familiars, the animals that go with the witches. He would call them sort of grizzly gut and vinegar tom and stuff like that. So great entertaining stuff for the people, but not for his victims. After several days of torture, more on that in a minute, Elizabeth Clark finally relents. She confesses to being a witch, and worse yet, she also names many other women in the village. You can imagine why. She was 80 years old, she was desperate, she's going to do that. And two of the women that she mentions were two of these ladies in the village of Lawford, who would go and help her occasionally, the Wests, Anne West and her daughter Rebecca West. So sure enough, Matthew Hopkins goes along to find these women and accuses them and tortures them of being witches. Now, poor old Rebecca West, she is put in a terrible position. Matthew Hopkins says, if you inculcate these women, including your mother, if you say yes, they are witches, and providing evidence for him, he says, I will spare your life. So he becomes her star witness. So she's left with a terrible choice. Does she say, yes, my mother is a witch, and then she can go off and save her life? Or does she say no to that and is killed herself? A terrible, terrible position to be. This is the Hopping Bridge, and I still think it's pretty original. I think it still exists from what it did in 1645, and this is one of the favourite places for Matthew Hopkins to do some of his interrogations. And this is a good place to talk about Hopkinson's methods and ultimately his aims. What's he trying to do? Well, what he wants is he needs evidence. He's trying to gather evidence to say, yes, these women are witches, because then he can take them to trial and he gets paid. And one of the best pieces of evidence is a confession, of course. So he would come here and we probably would call it dunking. He had this rather interesting euphemism of just swimming. He would swim the women, you know, put them on ropes and dunk them down into the water here until they confessed. He also wrapped it up in that whole idea, you know, if you sink, you are innocent. If you float, you are a witch. Because obviously he's going to float them because he wants them to survive because he's going to get the money. So then he can get his evidence, say, look, she's floated. He did dress them in billowing dresses, so they all floated, but that's a different method. But a lot of women were dunked into this little lake here in Manningtree. Another method of his was called watching, which is exactly what he did to Elizabeth Clark when he first knocked on her door. This essentially is sleep deprivation, where he would sit them in a chair, and if they're just about to fall asleep, he'd stand them up and he'd make them march up and down, and this would happen for days. These women would not sleep for days, so they were totally sleep deprived, so totally desperate. And Elizabeth Clark, she was 80, so the impact it's going to have on her is huge. Other bits of evidence he looked for, well, he was looking for familiars. Essentially, there's a belief that witches always had like a cat with them, which was the actual devil as well, to do their dirty work. So he was looking for animals. Lots of people in the 1640s had animals, and even if he couldn't find a cat or something, he'd find a fly or something like that, and that would be used as evidence. He looked for the devil's marks, sort of moles and things on their skin, and he also had this little sort of knife thing, a dagger, which he would stab the woman with, and it wouldn't go in. It's like one of those, you know, the joke shop knives, that the plastic knife goes back into the handle of the knife. He would do that and say, look, she's a witch, she can resist stabbing. All contrived, of course, but it didn't matter. This was all evidence that he could use and he could take to a court. This is Colchester Castle, and many of the women were brought here after all the torture, etc. They came here. Now, as I say, they've been tortured, they were in a vulnerable state, they'd not slept for hours, and coming here, it was maybe even worse, because you would describe basically in there a dungeon. The women were put in a dungeon at the bottom of the castle, rats, wet, disease, things like that. And indeed, 4 of the women, before they go on trial, die here in the prison, in the castle. Horrendous conditions. But they do get put on trial in July of 1645. They go to Chelmsford, deeper into Essex, the Chelmsford Assizes, And it really is not a fair fight for these poor women. I mean, so you've got to remember these women anyway, they're not very well educated. They're just from farming communities. They're terrified. They're exhausted. There's no way they're going to be able to defend themselves. And then Matthew Hopkins comes in, and there's all this fervour around them. He comes in with all this evidence. What evidence has he got? Well, he made them strip naked and show sort of marks on their body, like moles and freckles, etc., to say, look, the devil's branding on you. He's obviously got a lot of confessions. These women were so desperate that they actually confessed. And he has his star witness, Rebecca West, who herself was accused. And in order to get out to save her own life, she is prepared to inform or accuse others, including her own mother. Desperately horrible situation for Rebecca. As you can imagine, they all get found guilty. It's impartial judges. They're also not very well experienced judges, because a lot of the other judges are off during the Civil War doing things like that, so having to get sort of temporary judges in. And it's a complete whitewash. The women are found guilty. And sure enough, on the 18th of July 1645, those women who've been found guilty are brought here to the main square at Manningtree, and they are hanged, including Anne West. A baying mob is here wanting to see their blood. A sad, sad tale. This is Knobbybly Oak, deep in the woods behind Manningtree, and apparently the legend goes is that many women were brought here to hide in the oak away from Matthew Hopkins. But at the same time, this is also meant to be on the main path that between Mistley and Manningtree, where Matthew Hopkins would ride in his cloak and all that stuff. So I'm not sure, that doesn't quite fit. You wouldn't hide somebody in the main path of where the person is trying to find them, but whatever the case. This is a good place to talk about what happened. Well, unfortunately, the fervour doesn't die down, and actually the witch hunt spreads throughout all of East Anglia, and about 100 women are killed throughout East Anglia, often with Matthew Hopkins really leading the way. The town of Manningtree is obviously ruined. Lots of women are dead, and lives like Rebecca West totally ruined. And what happens to Matthew Hopkins? Well, he actually dies just a couple of years later, 1647, aged 28, probably of TB. There was some rumour that he was a victim of a witch hunt himself, but that's not, there's no real evidence for that. It probably was tuberculosis, and he does die of that. So a slightly painful death, but not as painful and as horrible as many of his victims. So justice maybe quite not there. The only other thing I really want to mention here is adding a bit more to the why. Why does this happen? And of course, one of the main reasons is misogyny. People like Matthew Hopkins, men like Matthew Hopkins, they viewed women as weak, as vulnerable, weak to the temptations of the devil in his language, but also they were weak victims that he could prey upon. 80-year-old Elizabeth Clark couldn't defend herself in any way, and so she was a widow with no man to defend her, and so he would prey on her. There were a couple of men accused of being witches, and indeed tortured and executed for being it, but just really small numbers, and they were actually men more that were defending other women. It really was misogyny and a belief that women were weak and vulnerable and needed to be cleansed. That is what is pushing Matthew Hopkins a lot. And what happens about witch hunting itself? Well, it does actually die down after all of this. By the early 18th century, 1720s or so, a law is passed banning this and making it an offence to hunt out and seek witches, which means that in England it really does die down. But unfortunately, there is still some interesting examples. In the year 2000 in India, in the state of Bihar, a man who called himself a Witchfinder General hunted down 10 women, and they were lynched for being witches. So sadly, it is still something that is there, and there are many examples of mass hysteria that we can still link to today. So I think this really is an interesting cautionary tale, a tale of misogyny, a tale of religious fervour, a tale of a charismatic leader with bad intentions. This really is a very interesting time in British history, and of course a symbol for that period, the English Civil War, the chaos that it was. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, or at least it was food for thought. Please let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, I'll see you on the next one.